few things to consider here, Paul. First things first, we're in standard. It's Timur Adventures versus, it's Dimir Rogues versus Sultai Ultimatum. Dimir Rogues has a favorable matchup against Sultai Ultimatum. Maybe not dominating, but at least in the tournament, it's won 67% of its matches. The other thing to mention here is that when it comes to matches, we're going to be playing best 2 out of 3 matches, not just games. So this is our opening match of the championship match. Now, Paul, what do you make of the matchup? Is it really that good, 67% for Rogues?
Well, if it's piloted by Arne Huschenbeth, it might just be because he has been dialed in for all of today. He's just been making some extremely impressive plays throughout the course of this weekend, but I do believe that the Rogue deck is favored in the matchup, and it was honestly the reason to kind of come into this deck to play the Rogue deck. You didn't want to play against anything aggressive, especially mono red. This is the matchup Arne wanted to play, and I believe he has at least something like a 60-40 edge in the matchup, if not more.
Okay. So this is really setting the stage here for Arne to become our champion here at the Call Time Championship. He's already had a young but successful professional career with multiple GP top 8s, including a victory and a Players Tour top 8. Now he's at the championship level with a finals appearance at the very least, but he is facing down somebody with much more experience under these hot lights, as it were. Grzegorz Kowalski, having made it all the way to the finals of the World Championship against Javier Dominguez, didn't quite get across the finish line, but he's used to this by now.
Yeah, but wow, Arne's hand is incredible. Wow. Turn 1 Wind Robber into Soaring Thought Thief, and now he can go Crab, land, and all of a sudden everything is turned on. He can even just run out the Soaring Thought Thief here if he wants to get in for an additional 2 points of damage and really put pressure on Kowalski. Kowalski, on 3 mana, Arne does have to be mindful of the fact that Kowalski could play in Elspeth, in Elspeth's Nightmare here, which would be really, really strong. You would get the Soaring Thought Thief off the battlefield, then take the Drown in the Lock. So actually, Arne, being mindful of that, playing around it and just attacking for 1 and making sure he has that Drown in the Lock up for that potential Elspeth's Nightmare.
Boy, when you compare these opening hands, it's really well suited here for Arne Huschenbeth, who is looking over at his opponent with answers to what he does in addition to threats that will apply pressure.
And here, I would Soaring Thought Thief here in response to play around Jwari Disruption, as Kowalski's list plays 2 copies of that card.
And does he have one in his hand here as well? He does, but
he foretold.
Kowalski decided to behold the multiverse foretell. What's really interesting? If you do anticipate that, you can go to your end step and keep up the disruption. Now, if you pass the turn and Huschenbeth doesn't have it, he can say, sure, which makes it a little bit awkward, but you can behold any time on, foretell any time on your turn. Kind of interesting little subtlety there. But at any rate, that Soaring Thought Thief does hit the battlefield and is going to start crunching in. And this is just a runaway so far, Paul. I mean, this really highlights why the matchup is favored for Dimir Rogues. They have cheap interactive spells, where on Kowalski's side, he's got these expensive kind of haymakers that he's trying to resolve.
Yeah, look at this. Arne can his entire deck can operate off of 3 mana here, essentially, right? And he's putting pressure, and he's got counterspell backup. Kowalski, in order for him to execute his game plan, needs to continue hitting land drops till he hits 7 to cast his ultimatums. Meanwhile, also try to control what Arne is trying to do on his side. Now, typically against the more traditional control decks, you can rely on Shadow's Verdict to kind of help tide you over against the aggressive matchups, but not in a deck that's playing cheap creatures plus counterspell backup.
That's right, and you see all of that here for Huschenbeth. He's got the Ruin Crab, the Wind Robber, and the Thought Thief on the battlefield with access to another Thought Thief, plus Mystical Dispute, plus Drown in the Lock that'll counter anything from the other side at this point. He's got it all.
He does, and Arne deciding whether or not he wants to go with the Drown in the Lock here, or potentially save it for a sweeper, because right now, it seems to me like he might want to just kind of hold on to that counterspell as he's done in the past and save the Drown in the Lock for the key sweepers that Kowalski could have.
There's the second Soaring Thought Thief going on the stack now for Huschenbeth, who has Mystical Dispute to protect it. It looks like it may be an eliminate in response, though.
Right, so this is going to get one of the Thought Thieves, but Arne still has 4 power on the battlefield while continuing to mill away Kowalski's library.
What does Huschenbeth want to see here to keep things rolling forward for him?
Well, at this point, it's going to be just more counter spells or Into the Story. Those are the 2 cards that he really wants to draw. Now that he found land number 4, definitely Into the Story would pretty much lock it up for him, as if he would be extremely likely to just either chain more Into the Stories or counter magic. But he's looking really good right now. He's got Drown in the Lock and Mystical Dispute, and at this point, I mean, Kowalski has to feel the pressure here. He might be forced to go for that Shadow's Verdict very soon.
Yeah, if he does decide to go for that, it's not going to work out. As we do see those 2 counters in hand here for Arne. And it looks like Kowalski is going to kind of take the middle ground here, go for Binding the Old Gods. It's one of those spells where you kind of assume it's going to get countered, but if it doesn't, hey, you're pretty happy with that too. It is a Mystical Dispute hitting it here, though.
Yeah, and you go for the Mystical Dispute here. You don't really want that binding to resolve, because right now Arne just wants to end the game here shortly. He's got 4 power in the air. If that binding is resolved, all of a sudden you have a very anemic attack force of just a singular Merfolk Wind Robber.
Down to 6 goes Kowalski. The Wind Robber still chipping away. The mill plan, not often a factor here, given that Grzegorz is playing an 80-card Yorion deck. It can happen. It usually takes multiple Rune Crabs to make it go, but for now, we're getting very close here, Paul. We see the Ketria Triumph, or the Zagoth Triumph, excuse me, getting played from hand here from Huschenbeth as he passes a turn. He's got 1 more counter left in his hand with Drown in the Lock.
Yeah, and actually taking a look at Kowalski's mana, doesn't even have a second black source here for the Shadow's Verdict. So, you know, what he really wants here is to find Mystical Dispute to be able to have protection for this Shadow's Verdict, but he also needs a black source to cast the Verdict.
Huschenbeth was quite excited coming undefeated from day number 1 when he looked at the other players' standard decks that were in the region that he was, as far as who he might be playing against, and there were very few mono red. That's what he didn't want to see. Only 1 mono red actually made it into the top 8 here, and as you can see, Arne has done a good job of dodging what he figures is his worst matchup. And playing against this matchup, which was the most popular deck in the field, Arne really did read the room well, and he brought the deck that matched up the best. There's an island off the top. Now, life total's getting to be very critical here, though, for Kowalski. He's going to drop to 2 here.
Yeah, and now it's going to be extremely difficult, because now Arne gets to untap here. He can Drown in the Lock and pay for a Mystical Dispute. So Kowalski is going to go for a Yorion, but even if the Yorion resolves,
Lethal's
Arne
still intact,
has 2 lethal attackers here.
Now, this does require Arne to not pay the tax for Luris here, right? He just 3, 2. Oh, he can actually just do it all, can't he?
Yeah, he could put the Luris in his hand, but that does mean that Kowalski can't go Shadow's Verdict into Mystical Dispute, right? If you go Shadow's Verdict into Mystical Dispute and you put the Luris in your hand, all of a sudden your Drown in the Lock gets countered.
Right, so he could play around Jwari Disruption, but not Mystical Dispute. He does decide, you know what, if that happens, I guess I'll have a Luris. I mean, that Mystical Dispute's a live draw here. It's Fabled Passage off the top, though, for Kowalski. And it looks like Huschenbeth has his bases covered, as even Yorion Sky Nomad would not prevent lethal damage from flying across at this point.
Yep. Yeah, you're going to see Kowalski go for either of these spells, and it's not going to matter because Arne does have the counter spell here. Kowalski doesn't have 10 mana to play both of his 5-drops here. And of course, the Seeker's Chariot is not going to do anything on this board, as Arne just has 2 lethal flyers in play.
Yeah, and if you're going to go for, if you only have one to go for, then it's Shadow's Verdict, because that's the one that actually solves your problem. Kowalski's not going to have very much confidence that this is going to resolve, but it is the play he has to make. And there it is, drown in the lock, going on the stack, and effectively locking up game number 1 here for Arne.
Maybe he won't pay.
That is the outs that Kowalski's going for here. He's going to cast Wari Disruption. Arne figures it out, though, found the line. You said he was playing well.
Yeah. Yep.
And there's just nothing left here for Kowalski to do as Arne Huschenbeth rides out this good opening hand in game 1 to a game 1 victory. And look, he used up every resource here. He didn't have anything left, but he picks up game number 1 of our opening match. I will remind you, if you're just joining us, this is a best 2 out of 3 games for this opening match. But in order to decide our champion, we're playing best 2 out of 3 matches. So even with a victory next game for Arne, this thing would not be over yet.
Yeah.
Sideboard time, Paul.
Yeah, and once we kind of go into the sideboard, I think we saw this matchup before, and I remember you saying something along the lines of Kowalski boarding in his entire sideboard, and I mean, I think that's what he's doing here.
Yeah.
As you can see here, what is this?
14
cards?
That's all of them.
That is all of them, because of course he has a Yorion as his companion, so he is just playing a different deck at this point. Taking out all copies of his Emergent Ultimatum, and of course, if you're doing that, you're also going to be taking out that Valky, God of Lies. So yeah, I mean, Kowalski just converting into just a Sultai control deck here and hoping that gets it done for him.
That's right. He's just, look at the cards he takes out. They're all slow and expensive, right? Emergent Ultimatum ×4, and then 3 of the primary targets for it with Curabes, the Sea God, the Vorinclex, and the Valky there. Those all come out together. And then he's looking at cards like Binding the Old Gods and going, I could fall too far behind, especially given the payoff for it. So he just cuts 3 of those as well, which I think is all of them for him. No, there's still 1 left in the deck. And then a few of the early game cards, Cultivate and Wolfalo Haven. And then it's all interactive stuff up there, as well as cards like Elder Gargaroth to get him going. But even the creatures interact, right? Like Pelucranos eats creatures out of the sky. Coma does a similar thing where it can negate them. Karavek does the same, it kills them, and then Gargaroth can block and create advantage on its own. The rest are removal spells or hand disruption. So this really is Sultai control as you described it, Paul, after sideboard. And it's somewhat transformational, which is hard to do for an 80-card deck.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you can see, it's not even like Kowalski's bringing in a ton of counter magic here. He's actually relying heavily on hand disruption here. Elspeth's Nightmare in conjunction with the rest means that maybe Kowalski can actually go with the game plan of removing all the counter spells and removal spells out of Arne's hand and then slamming a Gargaroth. Because Arne's deck, if you strip away all the cards, does have a difficult time dealing with the powerful 5-mana creature.
Look at this opener here from Arne. He has the untapped Black Source with double Thieves Guild Enforcer, plus Skyclave Shade, and a pair of Mystical Disputes with a Drown in the Lock to back it up. This is another beautiful mix of early pressure plus disruption.
Yeah, and this is precisely why you want to be on the rogue side in this matchup. I mean, he's got 2 lands. He's got the disruption. He can play creatures at instant speed. The deck... And, he's got recursive threats here with the Skyclave Shade, and he's got the Lurrus too. So, I mean, again, Kowalski has quite the hill to climb. Meanwhile, when you look at Kowalski's side, he's holding a 7-mana card that, while powerful, not going to see it for a while, right? And it's just kind of sitting in your hand when you have it in your opener.
If I had to predict, Paul, I'd say we're not going to see it at all. I mean, it looks like that thing's going to get stuck in hand for the duration if it goes this way for Kowalski. He's short on cards, doesn't have any ramp to speak of here. And with the hand that we see here from Huschenbeth, look at this. He's got Mystical Dispute ready, and he's going to snap off an Omen here.
Wow.
That's aggressive.
Yeah.
He knew it, too. He had it all ready to go. That's pretty funny.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's really the only thing. I suppose he could have had a removal spell, right? In which case it wouldn't have worked. But now Kowalski doesn't really have any other options here. He could, I guess, just choose to put Yorion into hand or go with the duress. Now, putting the Yorion into hand is more mana efficient, right? You get to use all 3 of your mana this turn and then set up for maybe a duress in a future turn.
No chill from Arne Huschenbeth, just countering everything, follows up with Thieves Guild Enforcer. Speaking of mana efficiency here, Paul, I mean, that's 3 mana used over the first 2 turns for Huschenbeth, including 2 threats on the board, bunch of cards into the graveyard, and a countered spell.
Yeah, and right now, if you're on Arne's side, you're just kind of hoping that there's not maybe an extinction event, right? And fortunately for Kowalski, those Thieves Guild Enforcers haven't quite been turned on just yet. So he's only going to be taking 2 here and not the potential 6 that he could once 8 cards go into Kowalski's graveyard.
Yeah, it's close. It's close. This really is a matchup defined by efficiency in the hands of Arne and raw power in the hands of Kowalski. I mean, he can go over the top. He can do things that Huschenbeth's deck just can't even touch. But boy, is it clunky to be on the Kowalski side of things when your opponent's so efficient with their mana.
And this is such a tough spot here for Kowalski because Kowalski doesn't even want to play the Duress. If you play the Duress, I believe that's going to put the 8th card into his graveyard.
No,
and
really?
that means he's going to be taking 4 additional points of damage off these Thieves Guild Enforcers.
It looks like he's going for it, though, Paul. Duress goes on the stack, and he's going to see his choice of 2 counterspells here. Dispute, he's going to take Drown in the Lock, but you were right, Paul. Boom. Those Thieves Guild Enforcers just bumped up a notch. 9 damage coming across. This is a 2-turn clock.
Yeah, and this is big. And this is a 2-turn clock, and he has Mystical Dispute up. No reason to play Skyclave Shade and run it into Shadow's Verdict. As you can see, he's already kind of hovering it, but I mean, this is it. Kowalski's just dead.
Yeah, and Mystical Dispute can counter anything that Kowalski
Wow.
can do, and he's going to scoop him up. That is Arne Huschenbeth picking up match number 1 here in our championship match. That was easy mode, Paul. I got to say,
That was incredible.
You know, Arne's been sitting there waiting for his chance to play again after running through the upper half of our bracket, and he picks up match number 1. That went by very quickly, and it had to feel easy for him. Those were not remotely close, just how he drew them up style games.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you could just kind of sit there and imagine the perfect draw, that's kind of what you would expect, right? Those cheap creatures backed up by a couple of timely counterspells, and that's really what you need. But the thing is, Arne's deck is basically, I mean, that's what his deck is trying to do. And all the cards lined up for him, and, you know, Kowalski tried, he had some interactive spells, but it still just wasn't good enough.
Wow, it wasn't close.
It
That was
wasn't, not
brutal.
at all.
That was an absolute beating. Those were the perfect draws from the Rogues player. And if we see that, we're going to have a very short championship match here. Speaking of, it's time to get right back down into the action here, Paul. We've got our second match ready to go between these 2 players. Let's see how this one goes. Gregor says, I got to get back on track here. Those were just not close. He never really got his feet under him in either of those 2 games. And Arne Huschenbeth, he said he was farming the competition earlier. Well, he's certainly doing that here. Arne the Pharma is getting the job done. He is up a match, and it seemed easy. It really did. That was so fast.
Yeah, now slightly different hand here from Arne. Not quite as explosive as we've seen in the past where he went turn 1 Rogue into turn 2 Soaring Thought Thief. So, you know, as the game does slow down a bit, you have to like Kowalski's side a lot more as that pressure isn't there anymore. And it gives him the time to deploy his extremely powerful yet expensive spells.
Tap land now for Arne.
And Arne debating whether or not he wants to run out the Thieves Guild Enforcer. And the reasoning behind that is he doesn't want to run into a turn 3 Elspeth's Nightmare, which is what's going to happen. So would rather just wait a little bit and just make it awkward for Kowalski's mana if he did happen to have that in his hand.
Man, how good is he playing right now, right?
No,
I mean, you mentioned it coming in, but he is just on an absolute tear. He also gets an additional trigger off of the Thieves Guild Enforcer by playing it this way because the Thought Thief gets to come in this turn as well, where, well, theoretically, the Thieves Guild Enforcer is still
Right.
on the battlefield.
Yeah, and I imagine we're going to see a Mystical Dispute. I don't, you know, Kowalski has no removal in his hand. He really doesn't want that Soaring Thought Thief to resolve.
And we do see, interestingly, there that Alrund's Epiphany gets foretold on his end step. Again, the condition is that you may only do that during your turn. That allowed him to leave up the mana. Just a small interaction there, but he does have the 2 cards now in his foretell zone.
Yeah, now Arne there, maybe thinking about whether or not he wanted to keep up the Drown in the Loch for potential Binding the Old Gods, but choosing to draw the cards here instead. Needs a little more to get going, because right now the Thieves Guild Enforcer simply is not enough.
He's debating on if he wants to play the Ruin Crab, perhaps, but there are punishments for that. As you mentioned before, there's individual removal or cards like Extinction Event. Let's see what he decides. Looks like he may just be playing Castle Lochthwain here.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to see Behold the Multiverse now from Kowalski. And boy, he needs to find some action here. Perhaps some ramp would be fine at this point. You know, he's got a pretty stacked hand. Oh, goodness. Omen of the Sea and Valky, God of Lies.
Yeah, on the plus side, again, Arne doesn't have that explosive start that he had in the previous match. So this isn't too bad. He, you know, unless Arne can find another creature to apply pressure, you know, he's looking okay. Kowalski does need to be a little bit careful here. Oh,
yeah. He's just going to run out Valky. Yeah, he doesn't have the access to red mana here anyway, so it's about as good as it's going to get.
But this is the ultimate punishment for not playing out the Ruin Crab, because the Ruin Crab was going to unlock that into the story.
That's right.
Right? Because they would have been exactly 7 cards, and now with the Valky taking the Ruin Crab,
cancel that order, Paul.
Never mind. You could just play Thieves Guild Enforcer, I guess.
Do you see Arne? He's like, well, hey, okay, that fixes that problem just fine. Thank you. Pretty good. Thieves Guild Enforcer is going to hit the red zone. No blocks here from Kowalski.
Hello.
And he gives him the hello. Thieves Guild Enforcer goes on the stack. And all Gregorz can do is laugh and give him the nice, not a bad top deck there for Arne Huschenbeth.
And we're going to see an into the story here, I feel.
Yeah, the shields are down now for Kowalski, so now's the time to do it. And that house of cards just fell apart for Kowalski. He had a decent setup there, but that Thieves Guild Enforcer off the top just unlocked it all. Arne Huschenbeth not only playing well, he's running well here too.
Absolutely. I mean, you can tell just by looking at his face. He's just like, okay, that works. That works. Hey, I'll accept that.
Ask anybody who's ever won a big tournament like this, and they'll tell you that you need to play really well and you need to run really well. Absolutely. And right now, Arne is doing both.
And now there's a real clock here. We got 2 3/2s, and taking a look at Arne's hand, he's got that counterspell still. He's got the Soaring Thought Thief to put even more pressure here. Kowalski now needs to find some removal here.
Kowalski deep in the tank here. He knows that he needs to get something going real quickly.
So this is 6 mana. If Kowalski has an untapped land, I'm not sure if that's a Triome or a Fabled Passage on the left side of Kowalski's screen. Mm-hmm. But if it is, that would be 7 mana for Emergent Ultimatum. So, of course, Arne is going to be mindful that this is the point. Next turn is the moment where Kowalski could potentially run out the ultimatum. Of course, he's got that drawn in the lock, however.
And Disdainful Stroke off the top.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, so now you can get really aggressive here. You can go with the Heartless Act here on the Valky and just get in for 6 and then keep up Drown in the Loch plus Disdainful Stroke. If Kowalski plays nothing, next turn you go Soaring Thought Thief.
Wow. It's funny because he's got these 2 Ruin Crabs in hand that he could go off with. Not even a consideration. He just has better stuff.
Yeah, the thing is, your game plan is to get 7 or 8 cards into your opponent's graveyard. That's it. After that point, the mill strategy is not really something that you're actively going for against the Yorion deck. You just want to clock them with your creatures. Arne just looks so comfortable right now. I mean, I would be too if I'm just sitting on 2 counterspells against the deck with all 7 drops.
It's the best feeling in the world, Paul. It's the reason that we play these flash decks, right? It's just you get to just fly circles around your opponent. They are the big ship moving slowly forward with all the big guns on it, but you've got the little Air Force here, and that beats it for the most part. That's what we're seeing play out right now. Kowalski just doesn't have anything he can do. He's facing lethal.
Yeah, Kowalski's deck is just playing Battlecruiser Magic.
That's right. Well put, Paul. Battlecruiser Magic against these little flyers, and they just fly circles around you.
Yep, and we're going to see a counterspell here. Kowalski's got nothing, and Arne's going to be one game away from being the Kaldheim Championship winner.
Boy, he must have plans after this, because he is just mowing over the competition right now.
Not necessary, but just in case.
Look at it. He shook his head, too. He's like, wow. He gets to still had all these 2 counters after all of that. This is just incredible. Arne Huschenbeth is absolutely demolishing the finals right now. He is now up a game in our second match. And if he wins this game, or the one after that, he's our champion.
Yeah, and he's making this look easy. Now, I mean, to put some things in perspective, at least this specific game, I mean, if he doesn't draw that Thieves Guild Enforcer on that turn, of course this game is completely different, right? But by doing so, he was able to put the A cards into his graveyard and draw the 4 cards. Had he, for example, drawn a Soaring Thought Thief, he would have still been able to put enough cards to turn on the Into the Story, but he would have been a mana short from casting it that turn.
We had a chance to interview Arne, and, he had some, I'd say, inspirational words, talking about his dream to make it here and that kind of stuff. And, that's the kind of stuff that can kind of get lost in the fray. It sounds like it's a commercial or a movie or something like that. But when you hear it directly from the person's mouth about what it means to them, him watching the Pro Tour back in 2015 and seeing the spotlight on the players, the level of intensity of the match, the prizes at play, and all of that stuff, it really inspired him. He said, I want to do that. That's the thing that I want to do with my time. And, here we are 6 years later, and look, it's a little different, right? We're in a different time here with remote and everything, but the fundamental pieces are in place, and Arne, we're watching him right now realize that dream. And it's a beautiful thing to see. Win or lose here in the finals, he made it. He made it to the point that he wanted to get to when he watched that Pro Tour coverage back in 2015, and it's just awesome.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Now, if you're on Kowalski's side, of course, you got to keep fighting it out. Some of those games have been kind of rough, but still in it, right? He can still pull this off and come back and win. We've seen him in the finals before, so that he wants to actually win it all, right? We saw him in the finals of the World Championships against Javier Dominguez, just falling a little bit short in that matchup. So he's got a long hill to climb, but it would mean absolutely everything for him to be able to come back here. So
absolutely,
still not over.
He's also been one of the most consistent performers at the highest levels. Has Grzegorz Kowalski. I mean, when he burst onto the scene, he wasn't unknown, but he wasn't where he's at now. And he's in the Rivals League, and he's been at the top of the game, and he's managed to keep himself there. Really, I mean, he's a professional's professional, right? That's how I would describe Grzegorz. Grinder, consistent. He puts in the effort, and he gets the rewards as a result, and finds himself in the finals yet again.
Yeah, I remember there was an old interview with Kowalski where he would talk about his testing process, and he would say, yeah, I don't think I tested enough with this deck. I played like 10 leagues with it and, determined that just wasn't a big enough sample size. It was something like that. And I was like, 10 leagues? That's not enough for you to figure out if you have enough sample size? I mean, that's just how much Kowalski played to kind of get to the level that he is now.
That's right. Duress is kicking things off here, by the way. Huschenbeth, he's got the music going. Of one, mine's going to hit the bin here.
Yeah, and a nice
drop number 2.
Good. Kowalski will be able to put together a nice sequence next turn. He's going to go Wolf Willow Haven into Omen of the Sea. Probably going to just do that all in his main phase, as he is playing against full of counter magic.
Skyclave Shade on turn 2 here from Arne. Not a lot to think about at this early juncture. We'll see how these things develop. As you said, a good mana efficient turn available here for Kowalski, though. He goes Wolf, Willow Haven into Omen of the Sea, as you described, Paul, and that's pretty darn good. Land off the top here for Huschenbeth. He's going to start things off, though, by attacking with Skyclave Shade. Castle Lockthwain, the type of card we might see relevant a little bit later. Right now, though, he can leave up Soaring Thought Thief, and I guess in some scenarios, Drown in the Loch. I think there's maybe just the one card right now, but so most likely just Thought Thief.
Yeah.
Bottom there with the Omen, he finds Mystical Dispute into Binding.
Ooh, so we might see
Bad.
him just go for a binding just as kind of a ramp effect.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel great to kill a Skyclave Shade specifically.
No,
right?
it doesn't.
So, so he's setting it up. He's putting the Yorion into his hand and then going binding and then trying to follow that up with the Yorion, potentially with Mystical Dispute backup. But
interesting to decide, do I want to Mystical Dispute this Thought Thief or try to go for Shadow's Verdict and protect it with Mystical Dispute? It was deemed too risky, and he's going to take out that thing right now.
It's just so hard to go. That's a bit of a greedy line. If Kowalski definitely had land number 6, that would have been a different story, right? Because he would have been able to go Shadow's Verdict with Dispute backup. But right now, as is, I mean, you just kind of have to go for the counter there.
That's right. And, you know, Kowalski is really recognizing one of the extremely powerful sequences that this deck can put together that you described a second ago, Paul. And that is binding the old gods and then blink it with Yorion. That is really powerful stuff. You know, you can kind of keep your opponent on this awkward scenario where they don't want to put anything on the battlefield that they're going to lose anyway. And, you know, in the meantime, he's even going to get an extra card and some scry off of the Omen of the Sea.
Yeah, and Arne has a Drown in the Loch. He needs to kind of find that balance of trying to put pressure on Kowalski, but I do not think he has enough cards in Kowalski's graveyard to actually have that Drown counter the Yorion.
Yeah, I think there's only 2. I think it's just Duress and the Mystical Dispute at this point.
Yeah, another reason to Mystical Dispute that Soaring Thought Thief in the previous turn. You don't even want one activation of that to happen so that you can turn off Arne's Drown in the Loch.
Wow, look at this Palaka Predation off the top as well. A little bit of technology here for the Sultai Ultimatum deck, eschewing a few of the tap scry lands for Palaka Predation, Jwari Disruption, and this might even be able to nab it into the story here.
Yeah, and we've seen Kowalski play very conservatively in situations like this, where he could potentially just go for the Haymaker here and run out of threat. Now, he does know 3 of the cards in Arne's hand, and it makes sense that Arne didn't play a creature this turn, given the fact that there's a Yorion in Kowalski's hand and a Binding the Old Gods in play. So there's a very solid chance that Arne just doesn't have a counterspell here, right, and just chose not to play a creature. But he could be representing one. So this makes it tough for Kowalski. Now, you can play the Predation. If you do, you will get that into the story, probably, out of Arne's hand, and then set up for the Yorion on the following turn. Of course, he will have to do a graveyard check to see. It is very important for him to make sure that the Drown in the Loch can't counter the Yorion that he has.
Yeah, this was actually technology put in there by our own commentator, Monty Devuti, who was one of the developers of the deck that Kowalski's playing. It was actually mainly aimed for the mirror, I believe, right? The Palaka Predation particularly good at taking away the big payoff spells in the mirror. But hey, taking it into the story is a big game here.
Yeah. The only downside of going for the Predation that turn means that you won't be able to get a little more value out of that Yorion, right? Because you could have blinked the Binding the Old Gods. Sure, you don't have a target to kill. However, it would get you an additional land, right? Which would give you just kind of more mana to play with, potentially allow you to play around Mystical Dispute in a future turn.
So back to the drawing board here for Huschenbeth, who has Drown in the Loch, Soaring Thought Thief, Cling to Dust, in addition to the cards that we saw before the Agadim's Awakening, the Skyclave Shade.
Yeah, I mean, he could go for a Skyclave Shade and then maybe just flash out a Soaring Thought Thief. Not sure he wants to just kind of go for the Luris. None of his options are looking all that great, especially when you look at Kowalski's hand with the Shadow's Verdict and the lack of counter magic in Arne's hand.
Okay, here's Cling to Dust. This is a pretty high floor card, right? In its worst case here, you get to cycle something away. He's going to target his own card to not hit the graveyard of his opponent. Kind of funny, he actually ended up hitting another copy of Cling. This also is a way for Huschenbeth to deal with Polukranos, which can be an issue for his deck. Although, let's just put a big, fat Skyclave Shade onto the battlefield. 5-3, your move. Kind of forcing the issue here. Hey, speaking of Polukranos, hello, friend.
Yeah, I mean, Kowalski is down to 14, so he could go for a Shadow's Verdict, which doesn't feel very good. You are spending 5 mana to kill a 2-mana creature that's been recurred, so he's already killed it once. There's a value play here. If you just go out, you just play out the Yorion, you can blink the Omen of the Sea and your Wolf Willow Havens, effectively making this Yorion cost 3 mana instead of 5, as you will get 2 back. So if you can find an instant speed removal spell or some counter magic off the Omen, you can actually cast it. And Behold the Multiverse is perfect. In fact, I mean, I think you might just... Oh.
No stop set there, so it went into hand.
Yeah, that would have been probably a good opportunity to just go ahead and just fire off that Behold.
Well, he's going to take 5 from the Skyclave Shade. That thing just crunches in and knocks Kowalski down to 9 life.
And Kowalski just going to run that Behold into a counter, maybe?
Yeah, he finally gets to play the game where he's the one casting the spell on his opponent's turn. That's something that he doesn't get to do very often. A lot of sorcery speed effects for Kowalski in his deck.
Yeah. And keep in mind, by the way, Arne is sitting at 12 life, right?
True.
He took 5 damage to draw a card off Castle Lochthwain in one of the previous turns. So, perhaps Kowalski can find some sequence of events where he can get aggressive with Yorion and potentially resolve a Polukranos and find his way to kind of take Arne out of this game.
Looks like Arne's just decided to say go. He's got double Drown in the lock, Soaring Thought Thief, and a Cling to Dust, both in his yard and in his hand that he could cast for various effects.
This is so tough. The thing is, your deck is so clunky. I feel it just seems like whenever you have an opportunity to use your mana, you just have to kind of run it out there. And
it does feel like that.
And then sure, he's going to counter it, but you're going to have to fight through those anyways. Now, what would be ideal here for Kowalski after this gets countered would be a card like a Duress, right? Duress that Drown in the Lock into Polukranos.
That would have been nice. Instead, it was Heartless Act, which is particularly awkward here, given the Skyclave Shade already having 2 counters on it. But Polukranos Unchained goes onto this stack. And Arne should have the line of being able to drown it as well as cling it before Kowalski even has a chance to do any type of escape nonsense.
Yeah, and this Heartless Act is extremely awkward. Very bad against creatures with counters on them. You cannot actually kill the Skyclave Shade here. All he can do is remove 2 of the counters here on the Shade. Now he could actually use that as a combat trick, right? Don't attack with Yorion. Remove the counter, block, and then remove the counters.
It's possible. In this case, though, 3-turn clock here for Kowalski. He says, I'll take you from 12 to 8. This also probably shuts off any more Castle Lochthwain activations for the rest of the game. So a productive attack. Now, the Cling to Dust, definitely necessary here. And this is why it's still in the deck.
Yeah, and it will bolster Arne's life total here back up to 11, so now turning it back into a 3-turn clock here. And Arne just has more resources. He's got that Mystical Dispute. He's got an extra Skyclave Shade. He's winning the race.
He's got him down to 4 also. Arne Huschenbeth perhaps on the precipice of victory here. We've played 3 games here in the championship match, and Arne's won all of them.
Yeah, and now Arne could potentially run out another Skyclave Shade. with Mystical Dispute backup. Now, Kowalski does have 7 lands in play, so if you can find an untapped land, that Shadow's Verdict, he could play around the Mystical Dispute if you can find that land. Arne could also just choose to pass, right? Because he does have an instant speed play available to him with the Soaring Thought Thief here. He has the mana to cast Soaring Thought Thief into Mystical Dispute, or Soaring Thought Thief into Cling to Dust.
Generally speaking, Arne has gone with the more default line of keeping your mana available and your options open, but we have seen him depart from that when he sees it necessary. For example, casting the Skyclave Shade a couple of turns ago. So he has the full range of options available to him, and he certainly is going to explore each option. In this case, though, it does seem like he's going to keep his options available.
All right, the Chariot does a good job of kind of holding the fort here.
Yeah, it's also a card that he can safely cast into a card like Mystical Dispute. So really nice here for Kowalski to help stabilize this board.
Yeah, and I wonder if Arne is thinking, okay, so if I Mystical Dispute this and tap him out, is there some combination of cards for me to be able to kind of close this game out? And I don't think there is.
What he's thinking, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there is. So it doesn't seem like it would be the best use. He's got the Soaring Thought Thief, but this Yorion actually does a pretty good job of kind of brick walling that. He needs to find a removal spell here. If anything, you might see him. Yeah, this is what he's looking to do. He's gonna escape this Cling to Dust and maybe try to find a Drown in the Lock.
Let's see if he can hit it. Cling to Dust on a non-creature here is going to get a card into hand, and it's of 1 mind. So perhaps something good for the future. But for now, Esika's Chariot resolves. And Yorion's going to hit the red zone here as well, so that will clear the way for the Soaring Thought Thief.
Yeah, but
Heartless
this is
Act almost assuredly going to take it down.
Instantly Heartless Act, yeah.
Yeah. Ooh, this has been a really good back and forth game here. The other ones were much more lopsided, but here, with the tournament in the balance, these players are very much going back and forth.
Yeah, and it's going to be even more annoying for Arne if he does go for the Heartless Act here, because right now, that of 1 mind costs a single blue, as he does have a human and a non-human, but this will remove that.
And back up to 3 mana it goes. Whew, there's another Soaring Thought Thief, so time to plan out the next turn cycle.
But this is rough. I mean, Arne's down to 7 life here.
Yes.
Skyclave Shade cannot block.
Doesn't have that option. And if it ain't going to block, well, it's going to attack. So in it comes. 1 cat gets thrown under the Skyclave Shade bus here.
And
oh, here's Luris.
We're going to see a Luris, and probably keeping up Mystical Dispute would be my guess.
No, he's just going to use up all of his mana
Kowalski has lethal here. He can... No, he doesn't quite have lethal.
He drew Eliminate.
He did draw Eliminate. He can equip the Esika's Chariot, but that would tap his Yorion to do so. He needs another 2-power creature to be able to crew the Esika's Chariot and then cast Shadow's Verdict. Now, don't get me wrong. Shadow's Verdict here is extremely, extremely good.
Right.
He's going to be able to Shadow's Verdict and attack Arne down to 3.
That's right. He will put him dead to another attack from Yorion. Yep. And there we go. Shadow's Verdict to wipe the board of Arne Huschenbeth. Get in. And the aggressor is now Grzegorz Kowalski somehow, some way. Now, Huschenbeth is going to need to decide what to do this turn. He can't wait. He cannot pass a turn back and let that Esika's Chariot get crewed in response to removal.
Right.
But he drew a Heartless Act here.
But you know what? I mean, Huschenbeth's hand is still great.
It is really good. Like Heartless Act, the Yorion, have Drown in the Lock plus Soaring Thought Thief plus Dispute. That seems good. And
he's got the Skyclave Shade here to potentially present a lethal threat here. So he kind of has a lot of answers. He just needs to be kind of careful here, and probably just needs to think about what Kowalski can follow up here on the next turn.
Yeah, Grzegorz wants to find one of his expensive cards, but unfortunately for him, the Drown in the Lock looks like it will be able to take care of basically anything, and Arne Huschenbeth looks like he may have the win in sight unless something crazy happens for Grzegorz.
Yeah, so there's a Skyclave Shade now. Remember, Kowalski does have Eliminate.
That's
so
true.
So he won't die here. Or on this very next turn, at least.
That's right, because it would take the combination of the Skyclave Shade plus the Soaring Thought Thief to actually get the job done. Kowalski deciding when to fire off and eliminate.
Again, it's one of those, like, probably just need to use your mana, right? And the thing is, given that Arne's at 3, you can just start making some wolf tokens here off that Wolf Willow Haven, right? If there's nothing else you can do.
Yeah. So Arne says, okay, go ahead. And it's duress off the top of the library. That will not protect from the Soaring Thought Thief, but it will take away probably a Drown in the Lock.
It will take the Drown in the Lock, and then Kowalski is just going to make a wolf here.
So they're kind of racing? Like, this is super close.
And the thing is, if Kowalski makes a wolf on the following turn, that's a lethal attack for the Chariot.
And that would leave Arne, one attack short himself. So this is just about as close as they can get.
Oh my goodness.
Another removal spell? All right, it's a Merfolk Wind Robber.
So that's a chump blocker.
Yes.
For a potential lethal attack. So now Arne can attack. Arne can attack for 2 and play out the Wind Robber.
Oh my God, these top decks. Let's also not forget Cling to Dust in the graveyard. I don't know if Arne has enough to actually escape it, but that can change the math as well. Oh my God.
Oh, and of course the Skyclave Shade as well. And the thing is, he's got Mystical Dispute backup as well. So I'm trying to think how he can actually get an attack in, and I'm not sure that he can. So Shadow's Verdict wouldn't do it. I mean,
it's another duress off the top, and that is not going to do it for Grzegorz Kowalski, and that means that Arne Huschenbeth is on the precipice of becoming your Kaldheim champion. He's got his hands together as he looks at the screen and says, what did you draw? What do you have in your hand? Is there any way out? Huschenbeth knows. He says, show me what you got. Do I got it?
Verdict won't do it. Right? It has to be a 3-mana spell. That's the only thing Kowalski can play.
And he knows that he's won it. Look at Arne Huschenbeth. He is your champion. Once that duress went on the stack, he says, I've got you. I've got the championship. And the incredible run for this young German player is going to end with him as your champion. What an absolutely incredible job. He picked the metagame. He picked the right decks. He played beautifully all weekend, farmed the competition as he put it, and he is going to be your champion now. Unbelievable performance by Arne Huschenbeth. Congratulations.
And I mean, just from watching his play throughout the weekend, well-deserved. Look at him. He is completely, I mean, look at the hype. Look at the hype. He made it look so easy. 4-0 in the grand finals here, playing the deck that beats the quote-unquote best deck coming into this and completely dismantling it here in the finals.